Hello. Welcome to our Remembering Don event. My name is Meg Garnett. I'm the archivist for Susquehanna University, and I'm also part of the Selinsgrove History Association, or SHA, which was Don's creation, as was this series of talks. One of the things a number of people have said about Don is that the reason he was such a good historian was that he understood that history was fundamentally about people and about their stories, and he was a consummate storyteller. So we're here this evening to tell stories about Don and hopefully hear your stories. The requisite housekeeping, we have a tame SU student in the back videoing this. Say hello to Ryan. We are going to give the full recording to the Housley family, and we've had people inquire if we would post it publicly. And I didn't want anyone to not speak because they were uncomfortable with that. So if you speak, if you'll pop to the table in the corner there afterwards, sign on my sheet of paper and just indicate whether or not you're comfortable with your part being posted publicly on the internet. And we will edit you out if you're not. But Grace gets to see all your foibles still. And finally, one last acknowledgement. We promised light refreshments, and you can actually thank Don for those, because when he set up the talks, he also entrusted the history department with money to buy refreshments, because the only thing more important than stories is cookies afterwards. So this is thanks to Don, and we're looking forward to hearing from you, starting with Kate, I believe. Lost her? There you are.
So greetings, everyone. As you can see, this microphone is taller than I am. I wonder if I will ruin things, Ed, if I adjust.
You just have to speak up.
What help?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kate Hastings. I have been teaching at Susquehanna in the Department of Communications, formerly Department of Communications and Theater Arts, for almost 3 years. So I only knew Don for 32 years, as opposed to most of you who knew him a lot longer. I'm not sure why I was asked to speak first, but I'm hoping that if I'm a dud, that the people who come later will erase your memory of how poorly I did. I was asked to share memories of adventures I had with Don, and I am not so sure Don would approve of this event. And I am going to back up and say, not so sure is one of the things that Don would say when he really meant no. So he'd say, I'm not so sure about that. And what he meant was, no, I think you're wrong. Oh, he would say sometimes, no, you're wrong, and here's why. So we would get that teaching moment too. I want to emphasize that although we're all going to tell stories about our fond memories of Don, he was a human and he was not perfect, just as none of us are perfect. And I want to tell you, one of his flaws was that he really was a gossip. He loved to get the skinny about what was going on campus, and sometimes he would get some of us together to find out exactly the story behind why a decision was made. Another thing that was not perfect about Don is that he knew the power of the eyebrows. He used them strategically, mostly to frighten his students. So he would put his head down a little and then look up through the eyebrows when he really wanted people to squirm. And he told me this in the teaching and learning committee. He said, well, you don't have eyebrows, but maybe the bangs. So, although he prided himself on learning a lot of student names, he really butchered a lot of names. And I was hoping that David M. Hoff could have been here, because he called David M. Hoff for at least 10 years, despite the number of times that he was corrected. And he got my name wrong to the last day. So he's always persisted in spelling my name with a C, but whatever, it was Don. And finally, the strongest oath that he would use about a person was to call them a horse's ass. that was he'd say, yes, he is a real horse's ass. And I thought, yeah, that is Don's strongest oath. He also liked to foment dissent. So I'm going back now to the 1990s when somebody very tentatively put up their hand in a faculty meeting and said, was there any chance that the former Lindback Teaching Award, which was $500, could be increased because it had always been $500 and times had changed. And I remember Don getting to his feet and saying, what if we indexed that to the cost of putting a roof on a house? Because when he won the award, he put a new roof on his house. So Joel was very upset with him for this. And so the next month, Don came back and he said, no, he was mistaken. It was not the roof. You put on the screen porch with the Lindback Teaching Award money. So lo and behold, they did raise the, it went from $500 to $1,000. Now, today, that award is a little more, and it is named the Donald D. Housley Teaching Award. Yeah. So I said, I'm not sure that Don would approve us lionizing him in this way, but I know what he would approve of, and that is if we thought of this as a fundraiser so that the next time that you're thinking of giving a gift to Susquehanna, you give it to the university archives. So that this is now a fundraiser and not a memorial. Okay. He also would approve if this were an oral history project. So let's just think of this as an academic oral history project. So I have 4 stories. One is about Don's ministry to others, another about his mentoring of new faculty, next about his curiosity, and lastly, about his love of teaching. So I want to talk about Bob Geist Day. I know Jerry's going to want to talk about that too. Don had a friend who has since been promoted to glory named Bob Geist, and Bob was born in 1922. Bob fought in the Second World War and lived all around the world, the Philippines and India and Asia, and was a wonderful storyteller. But toward the end of Bob's life, his wife, Janet, became less and less able to take care of herself. And Bob was lonely. He needed to have conversations with grown-ups from time to time. So Don started this thing called Bob Geist Day, which was usually on a Thursday, and it was almost always at the Selinsgrove Brew Pub. And for a while, it was a boys' club because Don was assembling people who could tell stories that Bob could engage in. So mostly baseball. Jerry and Jeff Whitman were the 2 first members of the Bob Geist Day. And I think they realized they needed diversity, so they added me and Linda McMillan. The excuse was that Linda was a historian and I read the New York Times every day. So we held Bob Geist Day. We had a weekly invitation that sounded like something out of the Wind in the Willows, because it was always the esteemed gentleman will join us at 11:30. We met with Bob Geist for 15 years. He died in 2022. Finally, he got to join Janet, but it was a ministry of Don's. It was taking care of a friend. And taking care of a friend in a way that introduced other people to one another. And again, a lot of baseball talk. The greatest compliment that Don ever paid me was at Bob Geist Day, when Don introduced me to somebody who stopped by the table. And Don said, "This is Kate. She's another historian." Aww. All right. So next up, I wanted to talk about his mentorship. He would glom on to new young faculty of what he thought promise and introduce them to resources and experiences that they would not have thought of themselves. And I'm thinking of the time that I was having lunch with our chaplain, Chris Tomford, and Don, and we had gotten a grant to do a project called The Vocation of a Lutheran College. And so I'm new, maybe there 2-3 years, and I say, "So, what's this big deal about a Lutheran college? What makes a Lutheran college special?" Well, it was like lighting a fuse under Don. So he formed something called the Lutheran College Study Group and set up weekly meetings and lunches, and we had speakers. And I remember, and Gary was at this event. I remember an event, and Barb, you may have been there too. It was in Greta Ray Lounge, and we sat in a circle. And our topic of conversation that day was what caused the Protestant Reformation. So we were to each go around the room and offer an opinion. And Dawn was almost weeping with laughter by the end of this because each of us spoke about it from our own standpoint. I was sitting next to Susan Hegberg, and she said, "Well, obviously it is music that caused the Protestant Reformation." And Neil Potter was across from me, and he said it was advances in science that caused the Protestant Reformation. And being a journalist, I said, well, of course it was the invention of movable type that allowed Bibles to be printed. And Gary, do you remember what you said at this point? Oh, but it was, okay. So finally, we took this show on the road. We went to a conference in Chicago and presented our findings about what makes a Lutheran education special. And I was used to going to conferences as a poor graduate student, but Don got us tickets to the symphony, and we went to Second City to see a show. And I thought, wow, this is how the other half lives. I can't wait till I'm a grown-up. So those were examples of how he mentored us. Next, I wanted to talk about Don's curiosity. I was doing a research project in which I needed to know more about the building of the Pennsylvania Canal, this division that came up, the West Branch of the Susquehanna, well, the main branch and then the West Branch. And all of the original documents, the plans, the correspondence, the pay stubs, everything are in the library in Harrisburg. And I was at lunch with Don, and I told him I was going to the library. And he said, "Oh, that sounds wonderful. Can I come?" Oh, sure. And Jack Holt was there, and he said, "Well, I'll come too." So we had an excursion to the library in which I was digging out these plans for the canal and taking photographs of all the original routes of the aqueduct set on the Isle of Kew. And Don was finding things, and Jack was finding things. Jack's plan was to look at all the places there had been mill dams on Penns Creek, because if you take a core of the dirt that had been backed up behind a mill dam, you can find the remnants of seeds. He was trying to see if Native Americans had agriculture out in Penns Valley. So we went out to lunch. That's when I discovered that Don liked to break the speed limit on Route 15. But we had such a ball going to Harrisburg. So that was Don's curiosity. He just had to be along when we were looking at the original canal records. Finally, I wanted to talk about his love of teaching and of SU. He started the Committee on Teaching and Learning and the center in 2002. He was its first leader. And to do this, we were all practicing on each other to have classroom observations. So I went to his class, and he gave his students a little chore to do. And then he got up, they were in teams working on their project, and he got up and he went to the windows. This was in the steel basement, and he raised the windows. And he went back to his desk, and a little while later he went and he lowered them again. And then he got up and left the room. So I'm sitting in the back of the room trying to be inconspicuous because I'm observing somebody teach, and the students continued to work on their projects for a little while. But the minutes ticked by, and it was 15 minutes. And I thought, what if something is wrong? Or, is this something he was doing on purpose? It was. He did that on purpose to make them uncomfortable so that they would start to color outside the lines on this project, because they didn't have him sitting there to answer every question. And my mind was blown. Because I couldn't imagine walking away from a classroom for 15 minutes just to see what would happen. He was always trying things like this just to see what would happen. So I wanted to say finally that on October 11th, Jerry and I and Don had Bob Geis Day, even though Bob Geis had been gone for 2 years. Don talked about his new research. He was still cranking away. He had a program he was going to give here to Shaw about the fountain at the intersection of Pine and Market Street. And he was very frustrated about the lack of primary resources. The World Series was about to start. I mean, I remembered the things that we talked about, but really what I remember is his ministry, his mentorship, his curiosity, and his love of teaching. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jerry Habegger, recently retired from the faculty, but I came here in 1989. So I probably met Don shortly after he got here, because he would have been a dean. And I'm in business school though, so but we really got to know each other that summer, and then summers forever and ever. We started playing golf together. The first group that we played with, Tom was part of that group. Tom McGrath there, Ken Fladmark, Don, me, then there were a few others. We played as often as we could. Don had the idea, we didn't want to join the country club. So sorry for those of you that are members, but because we didn't want to play the same course every week. So that the whole point was we'd play different courses. And so we kept doing that. What's that been now? Probably, 35 years? Yeah, 35 years. A dozen or more rounds. So what are we talking about? About 400, 500 rounds of golf. Gary, who's coming on later, Gary joined us, I'm not exactly sure, not at the very beginning, but not very far into it. And we've been playing ever since. And you really you become really good friends in the golf course, because the golf game was lousy. So you had to have something to talk about. And so we became real good friends. And Kate pointed to something that actually came up from golf conversations Don and I had on the golf course. When Don decided stepping down from dean to teaching, he came up with this notion that he didn't know how to teach anymore. Of course, he's an award-winning teacher. I don't know how to teach anymore. And that's where we got into the conversation about the Committee on Teaching and Learning idea. Although at first it wasn't even that. He did some research and learned about these cell teaching cells that Kate mentioned earlier. And we decided that would be a good way to start. We were in August, and he said, well, how are we going to recruit people? And Don, as Don always is, says, we're just going to do it. And so we went to campus. It was after we had lunch, and we go to campus. This is before anybody's really, only a few people on campus. He says, whoever's on campus is in a teaching cell. And so we walk into a lab, and a brand new faculty hire. She's in there fixing her lab. There's Don Housley, who she probably interviewed when she came to campus because he would have been dean at the time, telling her, "You're in a teaching cell." And and we caught we caught 4 or 5, and that was the beginning of it. So we had it, and then the committee began, and now it's a center, and so on and so. But it was all part of his desire to make sure he knew how to teach and better teach. And as Kate said, he certainly knew how to teach, but it was a good thing, and I learned a lot from him on the teaching. The Bob Geist days, I know that those were actually. I think it was just Bob and Don and I first started off, and then we built that into it. They were great times. Bob always brought a cutout article from the New York Times. It was a big deal to be able to, and at the time we could actually get the Times. And so, and so Don would have had the Times and I would have seen the Times, and we'd spend time talking about Bob's new article that he thought was pretty important. So those would be the serious conversations. The three of us have Penn State connections. I'm Penn State undergrad, Bob was, and Don has the graduate degrees. So of course, Penn State sports, especially Penn State football, and how much we dislike what Joe Paterno was doing. Like everybody else, oh man, well they're winning, but he's not doing it the right way. So we had a lot of conversations about that. Dan was actually a real good athlete. I got here after I understand he was quite a basketball player, a terror at the faculty basketball outings. But in golf, when in the early days, he was clearly the best of us by far. He was the one that was actually showed some signs of being a real golfer at one time. He was a fanatic fan of UConn women basketball. That's his UConn ties. He just loved that. He's always watching them, loved them. And he's a really big Boston Celtics fan. And it's always one of the funniest things talking to him about the Celtics. He said, Don, did you watch the Celtics last night? I said, no, I can't watch them. I can't watch them. I can't. I just can't see that. I get too tense. And so he just would. It was a funny thing to do that. So the sports became a big part of our topic. But then Kate and Linda and Jeff and we talk about history books that we're reading. History, obviously, I was the accountant, but I did like history, and so we'd often be reading different history books, and we give conversations about that. So I learned a lot about history from him, a lot, and not so much any particular area of history, but what historians do. I don't think I'd ever known that. I even went with him to the archives a time or two to see what in the world he did there. I would have liked to have done the library thing. That would have been fun. But to see the detail and the effort they put in to actually be able to support what they're saying with real data. And the other thing is, especially as he wrote the history of Susquehanna, how you take that and frame it into something that's actually interesting and readable. It was a lot of fun. As he wrote that book, mainly actually, as long as we were both in town, at least once a week we had lunch. And overall 33 years. But while he was writing that book, he told me what he was doing. That would be the conversation mostly, chapter by chapter by chapter. So then the book comes out, and he gives me a copy, and a couple of weeks later he said, "Did you read it?" And I said, "I started to, but I know everything in this book." Same thing happened when you did the Geisinger history. I don't know that anybody has ever seen the Geisinger history book, but I know Geisinger history from that same project. So, but that was it was a lot of fun to learn that kind of thing. Another time when Don always jumped in. I mean, when something needed to be done, he always jumped in. And for me, I was involved in creating and starting the Habitat for Humanity affiliate in this area. And we'd gotten going. It was a little bit slow going, but we got started. So we finally got the first house that we were building. It was over in Beavertown. And Don and I had talked about it. And I told Don, you know what? They need somewhere to pound nails. Let's go help. And so our first event together in Habitat was pounding nails on the floorboard on this house, and it got him. It got him, and he then got very involved. He actually was president for several years, and a major. In fact, in the time that he was president, we went from being somewhat of a disorganized to a very well organized and very well developed affiliate. That's again another thing. He made sure we knew what we were doing, and then we all walked out. We did have a problem. If we all stayed, then it would be ours, and so we all kind of walked away. But fortunately, it's still there. So that was another great time. I don't know. I think I probably said it. Oh, I have one other thing. Is as many friends as Don had, and you say, how could he have any enemies? Well, he had an enemy, and he came at me, and he was frustrated. Groundhogs. He could not. He could not figure out how to get rid of the groundhogs. He would trap them. He'd take them miles away, and they'd show up again. Nemesis, and I know that. That's it.
Hi, my name is Gary Fink, and I was a Susquehanna for 45 years now, but I want to argue about our golf game. Wait a minute, but I'll get to that. I'll get to that in a minute. What I want to really talk about is the kind of man Don Housley was, in the sense of how he dealt with me and the things he did for me, and so on, because very literally he was the first voice I heard from Susquehanna University. In the summer of 1980, I was painting the back porch of our house in upstate New York. I was a high school teacher. And he called from Susquehanna, and I'd been sort of looking for a job. High school teaching was fun, and I had a chance to run a department, but I didn't want to grow old as a high school teacher, for sure, because it ages you to a large extent. But I came down here, and Don was the first person I talked to face in his office. And he was the acting dean at the time. He introduced me to all the other people that I had to talk to that day. 2 weeks later, I signed on. And despite the fact that I figured, okay, maybe this is 4 or 5 years, and then we'll see what else I can do, here I am, okay? And I did it, officially retired at the end of 2016. But I still go over and mentor students and so on. And I think Don represents the kind of person who, at least for me, somebody who listened. And so at least I figured, even if he doesn't accept what I'm saying, he's paying attention. And the more he paid attention, the more willing I was to do whatever it is I could to make my job bigger in that sense. Don had a way of putting things. One of the first things I had a chance to do was Don came into my office and said, my office was a desk in, what was that, Cybert Hall, before it was renovated. Anybody go back that far? And they were trying to decide whether to tear it down or renovate it. Yeah, I had an office in there. It wasn't in the basement down there where the pipes dripped on people and so on. But I did. And he talked to me about something called the Act 101 program, which was really an affirmative action program. And his way of putting it was, I have good news and bad news. Good news is we got this grant approved, and now we have an Act 101 program. The bad news is we got this grant approved and we have an Act 101 program. And that was a really good summary of all that. because that was kind of an uphill fight. But it also was the beginning of whatever I did at this school became larger. And later, when Don was interim dean again, he was always, I guess, the utility man, I think, in that sense for the university. He was also the person who came into my office in 1993 and told me, good news, we created something called the Writers Institute, and there isn't any bad news about this. And in that sense, he helped cobble together the job that I did for the rest of my career here, which was to run a creative writing program. So I have nothing but thanks. And I wanted to make sure that I said that sometime this evening. Also, Don had a way of getting, making people feel belonging. And I guess the one that comes most immediately to mind, I got invited to the Steel Hall Christmas party. And I don't know how many people back in its prime. There are a lot of stories about that, and I'm going to skip some of them. Yeah, there were a few incidents. But what I didn't understand was this seemed really important. Jerry Gordon, if some of you remember him, made sure that I understood that it was special that I got to be here because I was in the English department. And there aren't any English department professors at the Steel Hall party. And so, but it sort of humanized everybody. And it gave me a chance to meet all kinds of people that I ordinarily wouldn't have. And so it wasn't so claustrophobic. And it was a whole lot of fun at that particular time, except it was way up the stairs in Steel Hall. Anybody know those stairs? I'm trying to remember the name of the secretary who was on the third floor. And she yelled down, she'd go, "Gary, I can hear you coming." Let's go, Gary. Because they're taller than stairs. I know by at least 3 or 4 inches. And so, it's like, oh, damn, I'm never going to, And then I'd get up there, and she was a smoker. That's what I remember. She would always go out smoking, yet I'm at the top. And so, anyway, then we got a Writers Institute house, and I didn't have to go to Steel Hall ever again. And that's when I got it. Yes, yeah. But later on, I got to see Don when he was running 5th graders, middle school kids, giving tours, and they would come by. Well, where we are there, if you don't know where the Institute House is, by the clinic, used to be the cap. We're in the rectory. So if any of you members of that Catholic Church, that rectory, Don had something to do with that as well. How do we get moved? How do we get our own place? And also, I have one more thing that I just remember. Don was the guy who volunteered to help us move when we built a house in Selinsgrove in the middle of the winter. Who does that? He volunteered. I wasn't like calling people up. And it was the middle of February, and it had thawed. And it was all slush and mud. And he was there for the heavy lifting. And so anyway, Don was like a really good guy for all of that. Now to the golf, I came on in 1998 when my knees were shot, and I had to figure out another sport besides tennis. And it was Jerry and Don and Ken and myself at that time. And then they told stories about Tom. That's what they did. Every time we went to another golf course, they'd go, "Here's where McGrath hit that shot. Here's where his ball bounced across the bridge and cleared the creek." It was that sort of thing. I don't know how much truth there was to that. Yeah, and it was social, and I think that's the good part of it. And I also learned local history. What I remember is every time we passed an old barn or an old school or a warehouse, Don would go, "That's where this happened in 1940s." And I forget every one of them. So I failed that oral exam if I had to come up with it. But every time we went down some road in Snyder County or Union County, Don had a story. He had an enormous, I think, patience, the kind of thing you have to do to write history, to be objective and to accumulate material. I don't have that kind of patience, so I write creatively, so I can just go, yep, it's whatever, and then you're done. And Don always, speaking of moving into the house, Don disapproved of my shabby golf equipment. It was my last resort sport. 3 times in the 25 years or so that we played, I woke up in the morning and there was a new golf bag on the porch. Not a new golf bag, not a new golf bag, but an improved golf bag over the one that I had before. And I still used the last one he gave me about 5 years ago. And then he always acted as if, where'd you get that new bag? But I knew where it came from. That and probably at least 100 golf balls that he gave me. He would go south in the winter and come home with a bushel basket full of used golf balls and so on. But what I want to do is, I'm going to read you like 3 lines of a story, a start of a story, because you do hear stories, you tell stories. Since Jerry spoke, I can bring this one up. Jerry once told a story about a student who quoted Ibid. It's fantastic. I mean, that the student acted as if Ibid was the source of the material and kept having footnotes by Ibid, by Ibid. And I said, thank God he was in the business school. And so I got something out of that. But Don told me this story, and I'm sure Grace knows this story as well, about their neighbors who were training their dog in German. They had a German Shepherd, and the dog bit both of them, and so on. And the kind of thing you do, I'm only going to read 4 sentences, but Don told it in all seriousness because it got nasty and the dog was out of hand and so on. But what I picked up on is not that history. I just thought it was wonderful that they taught the dog in German. Anyway, so it begins something like this. The story is called Sweetie, and it's a really short story. And it's subtitled, I guess, Liebling. I can't pronounce German, even though that's my heritage, but I'm pretty sure that means sweetie, darling in German. But, and so that Grace may understand, I changed the tone. It's not Don speaking anymore, but our neighbors, Peter and Christine, have been training their dog in German. 9, they say, stop, blieb. I had to look that last one up to learn it means stay. The dog is a German Shepherd, but still. And then it goes on. But and it gets worse, and so on. But yeah, the point being that it was good to ride in the car with Don. There was always conversation, and he always listened as well. So I want to stop with, this is where I wanted to end up. This is the eve, actually it'll be an anniversary tomorrow of, I somehow managed to fall about 10 feet into my backyard with a thud and broke 6 ribs. spent a day in ICU and so on. Anyway, it wasn't a good moment. And I also had bronchitis at the time. So every time you cough, you go, oh God. And they give you this cushion that's pink and looks like lungs. And they go, here it is. And then you ask, like, what are you going to do to fix these ribs? And they go, they find themselves. They find themselves. Anyway, the point of that story is not so much about my injury. It's that about 10 days later is my birthday, and we were with our sons and so on somewhere else, and it was actually the first time I'd done anything except walk up and down the street a bit. And so it's also my grandson's birthday. But just out of nowhere, Dawn called. I thought it was going to be my daughter calling from California or my sister calling from Pittsburgh. But it was Dawn. I still feel something for that. And he just simply wanted to find out how I was doing. He didn't have to call or do anything like that. But I still appreciate that. And it was a wonderful moment. Thanks.
The floor is open. Whoever would like to have any someone else.
Just kind of on the fly. I am Elizabeth Reese. People call me Liddy. I don't know Dr. Housley per se. I know Mr. and Mrs. H. I met them when I was 2. Don't really remember that moment, but I remember all of the others. The big thing I remember, and mine will be short, was every time I would walk into the house. I guess I should take a step back. I'm a teacher now. So what he did, what Mr. and Mrs. H did for me, was every time I walked into the house, and it was a lot, over a lot of years, I'm not gonna say how many, right? But who's counting? Gauchos, stories, singing, mud pies, all of the things that I would walk into the house, and Mrs. H would be there. Liddy, Mr. H would come around the corner from somewhere and be like, Liditha, how are you? Every time you walked into that house, you got acknowledged. I did. Every single time. And I'll reiterate, it was a lot of times that I came in that door. Every time. And what I did is in my classroom, I'm an emotional support teacher at the Lewisburg High School, at the middle school, or the high school in Milton. I started there too. Even in my sub-plans, it is the first thing on those sub-plans. Acknowledge every single person who walks through the door. Every single time. That's what I took away from Mr. H.
I don't recognize any of you people. You're too old. But But the pictures of Don reminded me of my fellow basketball player on Friday nights. It was in the old gym, and we could only get in there at 10 o'clock. So we'd go in at 10 and play till 11, and then we'd go to somebody's house. I don't know if Grace ever left us in her house. Probably not. But we'd go to somebody else, and with Don, we would solve all the problems of the world. And then we'd get up and teach 8 o'clock classes the next morning. So it was a fun time. And Don never, I think he was too short, but he never got his teeth knocked out on my head like Jerry Gordon and Neil Potter. But I had one golfing adventure with Donald, and it was over at the Middleburg Golf Course. And it was the only time I played golf, or first time I played golf, I guess. And Don came out and he says, Fred, you have to, he said, I'm not sure, but I think you have to leave the course. You rolled your cart across the green, which was not a good thing to do. And my last story about Don was he and Bob Tyler, who often got together for wine, were walking out late at night. I don't remember how late at night. Well, I don't know how late at night it was, but it was Selinsgrove cleanup. And you might remember I had a bicycle that I rode around, and it was my daughter's bicycle, so it was pretty much of a sentimental thing. But anyway, that night, for some reason, I usually parked it behind the house, but that night I parked it out front. Well, Don and Bob came by, and they said, there's Fred's bicycle. Let's hide it, and he'll be all worried. Unfortunately, they didn't, and it was taken away by somebody in the cleanup. So,
Helen saying I have to tell a couple stories. I shared some with Grace on Tuesday that I won't share. We had some fun times. One of my favorite things to remember that's a more recent memory is serving on the call committee for Pastor Dahl at Sharon Lutheran. And Don was the chair of that committee. He also chaired the search committee when Chris Tomford was hired, and I was on that one too. And the kind of style, talent, good thinking, clear thinking, Don always made sense of things that I certainly appreciated. And I appreciated his support while I was dean. There were a lot of years where I was the only woman in the room, and it wasn't always easy. And I could get pretty cranky at times about it. I still remember it was Don who started women's studies at Susquehanna. He would invite me to come and sit in on the class and do some of the talking and share some stories. It's he who then hired Sue Bowers, and the program was off and running, and suddenly there was a whole women's studies program. The other Susquehanna one I remember, I don't see anybody here who might remember the science stories. One of his times as dean, I think he was really dean, not interim, at that point when the first renovations took place at Fisher Science. And I still remember Don saying, I'm not sure I know enough about science. So being Don, guess what he did? He learned, he listened, talked to all the people in the department, and designed that first renovation and saw it through to fruition. Just such a good, wonderful person and a great colleague. The other thing I always appreciated, one of the things that allowed me to stay as long at Susquehanna as I did, my best friends were always faculty members, not other administrators. And boy, when those tenured faculty members planted their feet, you got what you needed to get. Because they could do that. And I too was proud and enjoyed being invited to those original Steel Hall parties. Another one of those times where I was frequently the only woman in the room. But just fond memories and a good friend and valued. When Grace and I were talking on Tuesday, it becomes like family when you've all been together as long as we all were. He's missed.
Sit there all quiet like a mouse. And the rat comes to the phone. I'm Rodney Reese, Selinsgrove teacher and entrepreneur of nothing. Don Housley was my neighbor, and I lived close to him, a couple of houses away. Sent my daughter down there to entertain him. But he had some interesting, I'm not going to say faults, but he wasn't good at everything. Some of you know that I have a sports car and a couple other cars I worked on over the years. I rebuilt several of them. And Don was curious about this. And he came over and he was watching. And like everything that he did with you people, he got the idea that he wanted a sports car also. So I remember going with him looking at a 68 Buick convertible. And I looked at it and I thought, oh my God, if he gets that, I'm going to be over here working on that Buick more than I want to be. So I humored him. I looked at some other cars with him. And finally I said, you know, Don, you're really good at history and really good at writing. You like to do all those things. Go buy yourself a new sports car. So he went and bought a Volkswagen Passat. And I want to continue on the groundhog story. Not only did the groundhog visit Don, he visited my house. And I had trouble trying to catch it. So Don brought up one of his cages. And I thought, oh my God. He was not that mechanically inclined. And this trap took a lot of my mechanical knowledge to get it to work. And he even brought the cantaloupe along up. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to load this. And the wind will blow it down, the trap will go shut, the squirrel will be in it, and I have to get rid of that. So the trap sat there for, I don't know, 2 or 3 summers. I never loaded it. And the groundhog never came around again. It was just scared the groundhog. So finally, a neighbor up the street said she had a groundhog. So I had my son, I said, take the trap up to her house and put it up there. And this afternoon I was in my garden working, and the neighbor says, hey, Rod, do you want your groundhog cage back? I said, no, leave it up there. And of course, when he had a garden, and we tried different things to grow there, and some worked and some didn't. And he built a nice fence and stuff like that. And I was trying this and that, but he'd always seem to order extra. So said, "Do you have room for more tomato plants in your garden?" I didn't have the heart to not try to grow them and stuff like that. But I didn't get any extras for a while now. My garden's getting smaller, but that's the story. Thank you.
I'm Lola Leitzel from here in Selinsgrove. Wasn't anticipating this opportunity this evening, but have a story I would like to share about Don. I'm a 76 grad from Susquehanna. Did have Don for American history class as part of my history requirement there. Knew the family before I left the area because the family members at Sharon Lutheran Church. I think I taught David in the 5th grade Sunday school class before I left the area. I taught in Maryland for 32 years, modern languages, and came back here to retire in 2010. Reconnected with the family at church, and with Don in particular, once I was accepted to sing with the Valley Chorale, Susquehanna Valley Chorale, because Don was a member. He sang in the bass section, and he offered me rides to rehearsal, along with Maureen Reese and Don. Don was the primary driver. Had some very interesting conversations to Lewisburg and back on those Tuesday evenings, going to chorale rehearsals. Within a year or so, he was very involved with the Historical Society and served at least 1 year as president, maybe more than that, I'm not sure. But at one point, he and Toby Skinner approached me at church asking if I would be interested in helping her with the museum. I had no background whatsoever, but it was hard to say no. So I agreed. I worked with Toby as her assistant, as the curator in the museum for a couple of years. And then it was like 2012, maybe fall of 11, when Don was president, and Union County was getting ready to prepare for their bicentennial. And because what's now Snyder County was when Union County was established, we were part of Union County. And their planning team for their bicentennial wanted somebody from Snyder County to serve on their planning committee. I'm not sure why, but Don approached me. Again, no background in history really whatsoever. But again, difficult to say no. So I accepted that invitation. That committee met throughout 2012 to plan an entire year's worth of celebration in Union County. They had activities once a month at least, all kinds of things. So we attended monthly meetings, driving to Lewisburg on a Thursday morning for an 8:30 meeting, which I thoroughly enjoyed because they were delightful people who were working together to plan that bicentennial celebration. And then the year 2013 came about, and I made every effort to make Don proud by attending as many of the events as I possibly could. And again, I enjoyed those. I wasn't much of a history buff, but I became one of local history. And when that year ended, they had a celebration in November at the Union County Courthouse in Lewisburg. And the commissioners were there. They're the ones who had authorized the planning committee to begin with. And before that ceremony closed, they called me forward. Was not sure why. And here, the county commissioners wanted to recognize me for my contribution from Snyder County on that planning team, and they made me an honorary Union County citizen. They gave me a map of the county and a certificate honoring that, and I still have those hanging on my wall. That recognition I owe to Don, because he chose to invite me to be a part of that, and I said yes. Within a couple of years, I was involved in an accident in Lewisburg, was struck by a car leaving the Arts Festival on a Saturday morning. I was on my way back here to go watch a softball game at Susquehanna, which I never got to. Wound up in the hospital, in intensive care for a while, in rehab. Once I got home from rehab, Don and Grace were very active in our social ministry team at church. And they coordinated, along with Pastor Dahl, care for me because I was in a neck brace, couldn't drive, couldn't go places on my own. On a few occasions, Don and Grace came to clean my floors, for which I was very, very grateful. But Don knew how to pick people for certain things. Like that was a gift. He knew how to approach that. And he became one of our Stephen leaders. We have a Stephen ministry program at Sharon, which is a caring accompaniment ministry. And in fact, I was supposed to go on the initial training with Pastor Dahl and Don in Pittsburgh. I couldn't go because of my accident. Don wound up being one of our trainers the following year, so I could be trained as a Stephen minister. Dottie's been involved in that program as well. But Don's empathy, compassion for people shown through wherever I saw him, especially in our Stephen ministry at Sharon Lutheran Church. I think we are all very grateful for that. But I just wanted to thank him for inviting me to do something I really wasn't sure I would ever get involved in doing. And it was a true blessing. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Ellen Berger. I was Ellen Mall, and I had Dr. Housley for every possible class that I could take with him. I took with him. I was a science major, and then I realized first semester of freshman year, I really didn't like science that much. I don't know what I was doing. And I talked to my mom, and I was kind of going through a little crisis there, like, what am I going to do? And she said, let me hook you up with my professor, Dr. Housley, because she was also a history major. And she said, you talk to him, he'll help you out. And I talked to him, he set me up with some classes. I sat in his class the second semester of my freshman year, and then I was sold. And so every moment really from my college years was with Dr. Housley. I worked with him in the summers. I did research with him for his book on the houses on University Avenue, and I spent a lot of time in archives and courthouses with him doing research. Every class that he taught, I took. I didn't care what the topic was. I just, if Dr. Housley's name was on it, I said I signed up for that. So I really only had like 2 other history professors, I think, at Susquehanna. I pretty much majored in Dr. Housley. That's pretty much what I majored in. He convinced me to work one summer at the Mifflinburg Buggy Museum. He thought that was a good idea for me to do. I worked kind of doing archiving some material there, and he would come up like once a week and check on me. And he convinced me when I was a senior, my senior thesis had been related to the research I had done with him on the houses for his book. And I made this little pamphlet that he was very much involved with and helped me with a lot. And he said, I think I'm going to send you to this history. Oh my gosh, I can't even think what it was called now. It was a history for the, like a conference. Thank you. It was a history conference for the history group of some, I don't know, can't remember, but it was in New Orleans, and he wanted me to go and present my senior thesis and stuff, which was related to the history of Susquehanna. And I was like, oh, okay, well, who else is going? Well, you would be going, Ellen. I said, oh, no, nobody else. I'm going by myself to New Orleans to present this information. It was very nerve-wracking for me. I know lots of people probably do things that are much more exciting than that, but to me, going by myself to New Orleans to present to hundreds of people this research that I had done without Dr. Housley there next to me was very nerve-wracking, but he could convince me to do it. Like I said, I would do anything for that guy. And so he said, you're going to go do that and you're going to present it. And I did. And so I really thank him for a lot of the opportunities that he gave me, and a lot of something that he saw in me that convinced him that I could do stuff related to history. And now I'm a history teacher at Shikellamy, so I'm trying to follow in his footsteps. So thank you.